Uh, Okay, great. Thank you, Raquan. So thank you all for joining us today. I want to just, thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. My name is Melody Webb, and I want to first of all thank the members of our team at Mothers Outreach Network, Deja Robinson, who put together the beautiful deck today, Allegra Hayden and Raquan Wedderburn, who are also very critical of putting content together. And of course, we thank our guest speakers today, our panelists, Alan Dettlaff and Maya Pendleton. We're really excited to hear from them today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Please continue to put your name and any information you'd like to share in the chat. And just take a look at our trivia questions to get us all started. So this question is, true or false, all states include at least one broad income-related factor in their definitions of maltreatment. We're referencing child maltreatment. So give you a couple seconds to just put the answer in the chat to that question. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and the answer. So while states are not required to specify subtypes of maltreatment that are considered neglect, most states do so anyway. As shown in the map below us next to this, there are nearly a third of the 45 states that make this distinction include 5 or more income-related factors, and all but 3 states include at least one. Income-related factors are things such as inadequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, hygiene, nutrition, and supervision, all of which can be byproducts of poverty and financial insecurity.
Maybe we delay the go live of the.
Okay, so if you could, everyone, make sure you're muted. Thank you so much again for joining us today. So we're going to move on. Again, my name is Melody Webb, and I'm the Executive Director of Mothers Outreach Network. We're so happy today to launch our new coalition in poverty preserved families in Washington, D.C. Today, what we'll do is we've welcomed you, we've done a little bit of trivia, and we're going to share with you who our organization is and talk about the sort of working mission of our coalition. And we also are going to then delve into what is family policing, and then we'll have our panel discussion and round it out with resources and how you can get involved. And we want to encourage you to go ahead and put your questions and any comments you might have in the chat as we move along. Thank you, Raquan. Okay, so who is Mothers Outreach Network? We are a racial justice, anti-poverty nonprofit organization that uses movement lawyering, and we are really deeply involved in advocacy. That's sort of the core of our work. And we are centering the support of Black mothers here in Washington, D.C. in the struggle to transform government income and child welfare systems from punitive to uplifting. And we do so through the following. We have legal programs, community engagement, coalition building activities, research such as guaranteed income, direct cash pilot programming, and systemic policy advocacy. And our goals really are around achieving economic justice and policy to advance parent economic empowerment and freedom, or liberation, racial justice, through which we are propelling narrative change and building power, and then political power and engagement in our democracy are also core goals of our work. Next slide, please. We want to talk to you about why this coalition was launched and who we are. The coalition launch came from our advocacy and work as Mothers Outreach Network, and the moms, some of whom are on the call today, really have worked hard over the past couple of years on some legislative initiatives, and we wanted to broaden our reach and include as many partners as we could. So, our initiative really, it's about addressing and achieving family preservation and focusing on Black family preservation. Black families are the most disproportionately impacted across the country, and particularly in Washington, D.C. The mom leaders are our core participants in Mothers Outreach. And we really want to grow our base, though, of this coalition, this new coalition. We're just beginning our work. So the priorities and mission statement will continue to evolve. We welcome your participation. Here's our core principles: include systemic transformation, parent centering, and deep systemic structural policy advocacy. And our partners are you, and we want allies within our community that we currently work with, and we want to bring round to our community people who are skeptical and don't quite understand what is underlying and what's driving our work. So next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot of the programs that we run at Mothers Outreach Network. Happy to share more offline. We run a Moms Empowerment Group, and that's a community of moms in DC who want to work with others and share their stories and make their voices heard through civic engagement and work through our various initiatives. We have a legal program that provides legal information, records expungement, collateral legal services that relate to being involved with the system, the family policing or child welfare system. The DC Guaranteed Income Coalition, another coalition that we co-convene with DC-based and DC metro area-based organizations and individuals who are working to achieve a permanent guaranteed income. And then we have an initiative that is a research guaranteed income research pilot in which we're evaluating the impact of monthly cash payments on the lives of Black mothers who are connected or somehow involved with DC's family policing system. Let's move forward, please. Our goals in this launch are, as I stated, to expand the base of parents, advocates, and stakeholders to engage with us as we pursue policies, practices, and laws that will eradicate poverty and help keep parents and their children together. We seek to educate members of the community, to bring you into that process on the history of the child welfare system. And we want to provide a space to discuss and initiate changes to transform the way we support parents and their children. Next slide, please. And Deja has put information in the chat. Please let us know if you'd like to join us in our efforts. We're here, and the reasons are pretty straightforward. We'll share. 50% of those giving birth in Washington, D.C. are Black women or Black people. However, they are 90% of the maternal mortality rate. And 34% of single mothers live in poverty in Washington, D.C., and they are primarily Black. Other numbers. Nationally, 37% of all children on average experience at least one Child Protective Services investigation by their 18th birthday, and more than 50% of Black children of that number will experience a CPS investigation by their 18th birthday, as compared to 28% of white children. At the Washington, D.C. level, we have some numbers here that are from 2020, that 678 cases in the foster system are in our foster system here, and there are 1,640 in-home cases. And again, these numbers are from a couple years back, and more than 50% of the children in DC involved or in DC are Black. However, more than 80%, there are more than 80% of the children in the system. 80% of DC cases are neglect related versus abuse related. Very important data. And in fact, for the most recent year that this information is available, it's actually 90%. So 12% of cases involve, at least 12% of the cases in the child welfare or family policing system have housing insecurity as a feature of them. And 15% of DC's population lives under the federal poverty line. While the city doesn't report this information, it is believed that 99% of the people impacted by and involved in the system are people who live in poverty. So let's move to the next slide. That's what's driven us to do this work. What is family policing? I want to ask you all to just put in the chat, like, what comes to mind when you hear the term family policing? Just share with us what that means to you. And then we're going to go ahead and review the terms here. So these are definitions we pulled together. The child welfare system is defined as a system of actors in government, agencies, courts, and private sector who implement the U.S. government's concept of child welfare, which is a continuum of services designed to ensure that children are, quote, safe and families have the necessary supports to care for their children successfully, unquote. Family policing, on the other hand, is defined as refers to what has more commonly been known as the child welfare system. In order to capture the roles this system plays in the lives of families, which includes surveillance, regulation, and punishment, all roles associated with policing rather than children's welfare. These roles are used to maintain the control and oppression of Black, Indigenous, and Latino families, which is also consistent with the practice of policing in the criminal law context. Next slide, please. We also want to review what we believe are myths or realities of what is called child welfare. Child welfare system is a helping system. And when children are separated from their parents, they live in safe and loving foster homes. Parents are offered services to address their needs. And although racial disproportionality exists, this is largely due to disparities in poverty. And the realities, as we'll see here, the next slide, nearly 70% of children in foster care are removed because of neglect, and that's a nationwide average. As I mentioned earlier, it's closer to 90% for the most recent year in which data is available here in DC. When children are separated from their parents, they live in safe and loving foster homes, or just kind of repeating the myth. So let's go on to the next slide to see what the reality is for that one. So the rates of physical and sexual abuse in foster care are 2 to 3 times the rates in the general population. The next myth is that parents are offered services to address their needs. Let's move to the next slide. And the reality is that services pathologize parents and do not meet their material needs. And the final myth is that although racial disproportionality exists, it's largely due to disparities in poverty. So let's to the next slide. And racial disproportionality is the result of racism. And that's the reality. So let's move to the next slide. Now we'll have our panel discussion, and I thank you all so much for joining us today. So what I'd like to do is just I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I am so honored to serve as the moderator today. So I served as an attorney representing parents whose children were removed. They were separated from their parents, and my job was to defend those parents, to help them either achieve reunification or navigate the consequences of having their parental rights terminated. And that's what got me involved in this work. Mothers Outreach Network has become a method by which we can do our small part here in Washington, D.C. to make sure that families stay together. I'm honored to introduce Professor Alan Dettlaff, who is he's a professor, he's an author, a self-identified abolitionist, and co-founder with Maya Pendleton of the UpEND movement. Maya Pendleton has an extensive background in lecturing, and her work with Alan Dettlaff in the UpEND movement has been pivotal to bringing great attention to the harms of the family policing system. And we're really honored to have them with us today. Alan began his career as a social worker in the family policing system, and today his work focuses on ending the harm that results from this system. He is the author of Confronting the Racist Legacy of the American Child Welfare System, The Case for Abolition, which is published by Oxford University Press. Maya Pendleton has been a part of the UpEND movement since its inception. She currently works as a researcher and writer for the UpEND movement, focusing on how we abolish the family policing system, the harms of the current system to children, families, and communities, and the world we will build post-family policing. Thank you. So I will encourage you all to please get your questions together and place them in the chat. We will have a Q&A section after we conclude our sort of more formal conversation. So I want to start with you, Alan. Your book is based on, or Alan and Maya, I think you're one of the co-editors as well, Maya. Your book is based on the idea that the family separations that are performed today by the child welfare system are done so for the same purpose as the family separations done during slavery, to maintain the oppression of Black families and the power of white supremacy. Why was it important to base the premise of the book, including the cover image of the book, on this connection to the family separations that were done during slavery?
I'm no longer seeing Alan as one of the participants. I think he might have just re-entered. So let me try to, yeah, just give me one moment.
Thank you.
And I'll go ahead and okay, sorry, just one moment.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Alan.
Okay.
Okay.
Am my connectivity okay?
Technical difficulties, right? Sorry about that. So I was posing the question to either you or Maya about the book and why it was important to base the premise of the book on the connection to the family separations that were done during slavery.
Yeah, I can take that one first. Is my connectivity okay now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I think it was really important to try to make those connections. One of the important aspects of the book was to tie the family separations that happen today by the child welfare system to the separations that happened over 400 years ago during the era of chattel slavery. Because I think many of us know those separations happened during slavery, but we tend to think of that as an isolated, discrete time in history without really understanding that even after abolition of slavery, those separations continued through what the state called apprenticeships, but were actually just a replication of slavery. Many times, children were put into apprenticeships with their former enslavers. So family separations really didn't stop after slavery. And we also know that there's been other times throughout our history where family separations have occurred. We know that Indigenous children were separated and put in boarding schools. We know that most recently, during the zero tolerance policy, many Latinx children were separated from their parents at the US-Mexico border. But we don't often recognize or state that there's never been a time in our history where the government has forcibly separated white children from their families. It has consistently, over centuries, been used as a tool for the state to maintain the oppression of Black, Latinx, Indigenous families. The other part that was important about that, and why the cover image of my book is an image from Uncle Tom's Cabin, is that family separations and the harm of family separations were used by abolitionists in the South to get white Northerners on board to the abolition movement. Stories about family separations were put in abolitionist newspapers. Stories about family separations were in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most widely read book of the 1800s. And it was the harm and terror of family separations that got white Northerners on board to the abolitionist movement to understand how horrible that was. We saw that happen again during zero tolerance, when there was national outrage over family separations. So what we're trying to do now in our work is to recreate the understanding of the terror and the oppression that comes through family separations, and to recognize that that now is what the child welfare system is doing, and work toward ending that practice.
I actually have a quick follow-up. Won't some people say, isn't this just a problem that is related to children being, poor, living in dire socioeconomic circumstances? What about the orphan trains and the movement in the early 20th century, or maybe it was the late 19th century, taking what were, I guess, largely white immigrant children to homes in the Midwest? So how would you respond to those questions?
Yeah, I think the response to that is to understand that it has the system's origins, even going back to the orphan trains, were for the purpose of rescuing white children from poverty while intentionally excluding Black children from those services. And then that has evolved over time to the point where we're at now, where it's Black children who are being overly involved in that system through forcible separations.
Okay, great. Thank you. And again, we invite comments, questions in the chat. Let's see. In the title of your book and the introduction, you use the term child welfare system. And then at the end of the introduction, you say, throughout the remainder of this book, I will refer to the child welfare system as the family policing system. Where does that term come from, and why do you all use it in the book?
Yeah, so the idea of calling it the family policing system, um, and there are other names that float around in the space about like what to call the family regulation system, the family policing system. But the calling it family policing in particular, for me originates with Brianna Harvey and Victoria Copeland, who write extensively about this system as a carceral system, and really highlight the way that the system works to surveil and punish mainly poor Black families and other families of color, including Indigenous families. So calling it what it is really a shout out to language and how we use language and how the use of language reinforces how we view, but also how we are able to operate once we know what things are more clearly. So the child welfare system sort of implies that this is a system that's really focused on well-being, on the welfare of children, on protecting children, and all these sort of like benevolent things when we think about the system, right? But what we know is that the system does function as other carceral systems do, like the prison system, like our policing system, and that the aim is not the well-being and welfare of children and families. And this is made really clear when we think about like what outcomes do people face after being in this system. So whether it's increased anxiety and depression in parents after they've experienced an in-home case or the removal of their children, whether it's the harm that children are facing within foster care, like the idea that this is a helping system really unravels when you think about like the experiences of people within the system. But family policing also brings attention to the way that this system works to literally police. So um, monitor the actions of, again, mainly poor Black parents and their children, but also separating them through obviously like foster care, and surveilling them through, treatment plans and all of and social work monitoring, all with the aim at sort of like this coercive, corrective, punishment oriented framework. So calling it the family policing system allows us to more clearly see what the system actually does, and also see how this system functions within communities with the goals of drawing attention to the way that this is actually a harmful, not helping system. Melody, we're not able to hear you. I don't know if
I'm so
you're.
sorry. We have questions in the chat, which we will have a chance to get to them, I think. So let me go ahead with my prepared ones, and then I'll move to the ones in the chat. So in your introduction, you write, the issue of intent is an important premise of the book. Then further into the book in chapter 3, you talk about racist intents when you talk about the history of mandatory reporting. One of the main points you make is that what some people call the unintended consequences of mandatory reporting laws that disproportionately harm Black families are actually the clearly foreseeable and directly intended consequences. So talk to us a bit about what you mean by racist intents, and how did you come to that conclusion? I mean, I will say that, people think about safety as a goal and as a role of this system. So can you talk to us about the racist intents argument you make?
Yeah, one of the ideas that we wanted to get across with this book when we were initially conceptualizing it is that we wanted it to kind of expose what we understand about the racist origins of the system and how all of the ways that the system operates has this undergirding of racism in it. In the same way we understand that today about what people call the war on drugs, or what's been called on the war on drugs. When the war on drugs was launched by the Nixon administration in the 60s and then advanced by the Reagan administration in the 80s, it was framed as this necessary thing that we needed for society because our families, our children, our communities were being harmed, and we needed to protect them from drugs and drug sales and the harms that resulted from drugs. We know today that the whole entire reason behind the war on drugs was to surveil and police and lock up Black people. People from the Nixon administration have openly admitted that it had nothing to do about the drugs. It was Black people who were a problem to the Nixon administration, and the war on drugs was a way to put them in jail and to demonize them. And we know, when we really examine the history of the child welfare system, that those are the intents behind the system as well, that the purpose of this system is to maintain oppression of Black families, maintain oppression of Black communities. And I think CAPTA is probably the best example of that, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act that allows for mandatory reporting. When CAPTA was being considered by Congress in the early 1970s, the legislators who were working to pass CAPTA had years of information since mandatory reporting hotlines started earlier in the 1960s, had years of data showing that mandatory reporting was leading to significantly disproportionate harm to Black families, that about 50% of calls to hotlines coming into these mandatory reporting laws were on Black families. And it was largely related to the racial animus happening in that time during the 1960s, during the civil rights movement. But even knowing how harmful mandatory reporting laws would be to Black families, the white legislators who controlled Congress chose to pass CAPTA anyways. So people often talk today about the unintended consequences of CAPTA, but when you think about it, when you know that something is going to cause harm, disproportionate, significant harm to Black families, and then you pass that law anyways, and then those harms become reality, that's not an unintended consequence. That was the clearly foreseeable outcome of that policy. So it was known that that was going to result in racist
opening
outcomes.
up presents that mother had brought for Valentine's Day.
If someone
even
could
the gifts,
please,
Your
if
Honor,
you can
they weren't
mute the
just gifts, they
caller, the participant, thank you so much. So, Alan, drawing this through line from, post-Reconstruction in America through to CAPTA, is a really important one. I mean, I think we really all know and can appreciate, or many of us, the importance of knowing the sort of origins and the history of policies, because they can be so informative and really help us shape our responses. So one of the sections of your book that some people may find controversial is your chapter on reforms, where you say that reforms will never work because they're designed to fail. You also say that the entire idea of reforms is racist. And what do you mean by that? So we have some slides that the UpEND movement created that discuss this idea. And wondering if we can ask you, Maya, to elaborate. I also posed some questions, so you all can take that in whichever order you'd like.
Yeah, so the idea that one, reforms are designed to fail, and that two, the logic behind reforms are racist, comes from the thinking that reforms cannot accomplish their stated goals in many ways, right? So whether reforms are aimed at creating more equitable outcomes for Black children and their families within the system, or reforms are focused on improving um, racial disproportionality and racial disparities. The issue is that if reforms are going to operate within the same system that is actively harming Black children and their families, um, how would they meet their stated outcomes then? So it's like this idea that if we're working within systems that we already know are harmful and racist, refiguring them, tinkering at the edges of those systems is not going to significantly change anything for the people that have to experience these systems. And again, like we've seen this across the board, and that, you know, people have been trying to reform the child welfare system forever at this point. This is not like a new conversation about the changes that need to be made within the system, but reforms have largely been ineffective at accomplishing a lot of their stated goals. To the second point, the reason why we claim that reforms are racist and of themselves is because so often reforms will admit that, you know, something is not working as it should within the system, but the reforms put in place often reinforce the idea that yes, although the system is bad and may be harmful, that ultimately, like, these children and families still do need to be monitored. They do need to be surveilled, and they do need to be under the watch of someone, even if that like looks like a nicer way. So we're challenging the sort of the logics or thinking of reforms in the first place and asking, why is it that we think that certain families and certain communities need to be surveilled and monitored, and can't make decisions for themselves and can't make decisions about the future of their families for themselves?
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to, I believe, what's our final sort of prepared question. So related to reforms, you talk about some of the current reforms happening at the national level that give the impression we all want the same thing. One of these national efforts, Thriving Families, Safer Children, says they're working to transform child welfare into a child and family well-being system. You are critical of efforts like this and write, quote, if we allow the reformers to succeed with their plans for transformation and the family policing system is indeed reimagined into a system that looks different, but where family separations still occur, we will look back and stand aghast, just as Frederick Douglass did when, upon revisiting the South 20 years after the abolition of slavery, as we realize nothing has changed. Family separations continue, Black Americans remain oppressed, racism continues to flourish, and the white child savers who led the efforts for transformation sit back and marvel at everything they've accomplished, unquote. What do you mean by that? And why are these efforts not something we should support?
Yeah, so what was just on the last slide is a series of questions to ask ourselves as people who are interested in moving towards the abolition of a system, but are sort of like, well, if reforms are bad, basically, like, where do I start? What can I do? And so part of this is directed to guide people in knowing which reforms like maybe get us closer to abolition, or which reforms sort of like uphold the system, keep us where we are, and in fact reinforce the system. So there's a concept that many abolitionists use called reformist reforms or abolitionist steps. And so this framework borrows that language originally put forth by Critical Resistance, which is a prison industrial complex abolitionist organization that's been around for the last few decades. And they ask these questions of policing. Some of them are tweaked slightly to fit more into the family policing system world. But basically, it's like if something's on the table and it's offered, does this abolitionist step or outcome reduce the reach of the family policing system, reduce the prospect of harm caused by the system, diminish the legitimacy of the system, reduce the power of the system, increase access to direct supports, promote healing for communities, promote child, family, and or community autonomy, and promote a society where the need for family policing is obsolete. So your example with transforming the child welfare system into a greater system of family well-being, if we're asking these questions, like we can clearly see it's not really reducing the reach of the family policing system, certainly not reducing the prospect of harm by transforming the system, definitely reaffirming the legitimacy of the existing system, and certainly not reducing the power of the system. And this is important because, like, if we go back to the quote you just read from the book chapter, but chapter is basically about saying if we undergo all of these reforms, but we haven't done anything to reduce the reach, to promote accountability and healing, to reduce harm, then we'll basically, you know, be right back at step one, which is like we still have this harmful system. It might look a little different, it might operate a little bit different, but at its core, like everything is unchanged. And so as we're doing this work, I think that, you know, we have to be very careful and real about the fact that abolition is not going to happen tomorrow. And that means that there are still going to be children and families who are within the system. Like, how do we make their lives better now? And the idea is that we should take steps to make their lives better now, but we can't be taking steps that ultimately reify and uphold the existing system. So it's sort of like a balancing act of like, what can we do now, but ensuring that what we do now is not going to be more things that we have to now undo later.
Great, thank you. I actually do have more questions, but I want to go ahead and go to the chat and pose this one. How does the troubling post-abolition apprenticeship model negatively impact well-intended attempts at work development practices in child welfare agencies and elsewhere? Should I read that one again? It seems it's and how does the troubling post-abolition apprenticeship model negatively impact well-intended attempts at work development practices in child welfare agencies and elsewhere? Does one of you want to tackle that one?
I'm not sure I understand the question fully. I think the apprenticeship model, what's important to understand about it is that it really wasn't an apprenticeship model. It was designed just to re-enslave children who were formerly enslaved to create another system of forced free labor. I'm not sure what the relation is to work development practices. I'm not sure what the reference is to that.
Okay, if Ken wants to give us a quick, succinct explanation of of their question, if Ken is still on the call, we would, you know, welcome you doing that.
Okay, I can, and I do apologize. It's a big question, but I guess I'm just commenting on. It seems like there's a root. It's rooted to, you know, the slave practice. Some of these apprenticeship job development, and it just feels unfortunate. It's just, you know, that's why I use the word unfortunate. Seems like there's opportunity to develop job skills and link young folks with opportunities in the job market, but because of our history in this area, it makes it for a tough sale, or maybe it's hard to get public funding for such practices. I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, I don't know if we lost, did we lose Alan again?
We might have.
Okay. Okay, so what I'll do is, Maya, if you want to add any further comments, and then we can come back to it if we have time later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing here is that it's great to connect people to opportunities to earn incomes and to have jobs, but if these things are happening through systems of punishment and harm, we have to think about like, why is it only through these systems that people are able to get access to these types of programs?
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for your question, Ken. And I'll ask one more of the questions in the chat. Is there information available about the racial composition of mandatory reporters?
I think that there is information available about who are mandatory reporters. Some of our biggest mandatory reporters, for example, are teachers, our social workers, our healthcare providers and doctors. So basically like almost everybody that families are coming into contact with on a regular basis. I know less about like what the racial backdrop of those folks looks like. But in many communities, you know, teachers also look like you. They look like the students that they're teaching. So I think what's important here is like it is really less about who is doing the mandatory reporting, right? Like, I don't think that if all of mandatory reporters were Black, for example, we would have better outcomes, right? Like there have been pushes within policing systems, within prison systems, within the child welfare system to basically like increase diversity of people who are interacting with children and families with the hope that like a more diverse workforce might change something. But that goes back to it being a reformist reform. And the idea is that, yes, like people still need to be reported, they still need to be surveilled, but wouldn't it be better if the people doing it were Black? And that's sort of like the type of thinking that we're working to disrupt, and that doesn't really matter what people look like. What matters is that families and their parents are experiencing surveilling and punishment. And so like, how do we stop that versus how do we change what that looks like?
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, thank you. So I think that's sort of responsive to that question, because of this question of whether, you know, if the mandatory reporters were of a different race, you'd have better outcomes. I think that absolutely addresses it. Did you want to add anything to it, Alan?
No, I think Maya answered that perfectly. It's not the individual actors, it's the racism that's embedded in the system and the policy. So anyone that works within the system that it's also based on this idea of this myth of benevolence. People think that when they call a child abuse hotline, those families are going to get help of some sort. And that's a lot of what we need to dismantle, the idea that the system provides help to people. Many times we have cases where, say, a teacher will make a report on a child who's coming to school hungry or without adequate clothes, or is reporting that they're sleeping in their car, or something like that. If a child's hungry and a teacher calls the child abuse hotline, the child welfare system is not going to provide them with food. That system doesn't have the resources for that. So it's not, there's many times well-intentioned people making calls to the hotline, but it's because there's a deep fundamental misunderstanding of what the role that the system actually plays in families' lives.
Well, Alan, I must have predicted your response to that question, because we recently testified before the local DC Child and Family Services Agency at the performance oversight hearing, and our comments about their newly launched Warm Line made, and our reflections on the responses that they gave and the sort of documents where they, kind of talk about their new initiatives. What they found is that the calls that are coming into their Warm Line are absolutely about people in need of concrete supports. We also heard testimony from the ombudsperson here for children, who talked about how she gets calls all the time about, children who are going to school dirty and hungry, And people are looking to report that to this agency. And so our comments were, well, why don't we, if children are going to school dirty and hungry, rather than have the schools call this agency, why not make the food and the clean clothing available at the school? So we absolutely see that. And then here in Washington, D.C., I believe the data shows that most of these reports actually are made by police officers. So just that connection between these two systems is like very interesting. So you're also critical of the Federal Children's Bureau, their new focus on racial equity. To some people who might be familiar with what the system calls racial disproportionality or the overrepresentation of Black children in the system, they might think that achieving racial equity is a good thing that we should all be striving for. Why do you say that racial equity is not what we should be working toward? And why are you making the case for abolition?
Alan might be frozen. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you want to take that one, Maya?
Yeah, happy to.
Okay.
So the idea that racial equity and racial disproportionality are
take back the old ones?
Are the issues.
So sorry, could you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so the ideas behind like racial disproportionality and racial equity being the drivers of issues within the system is again like a logic, a way of thinking that we would like to disrupt. So the problem is not that racial disproportionality exists within the system. Therefore, the solution is not that we should have a system that's more proportional in who it serves and who finds themselves in the system. That thinking again reaffirms this idea that the system should exist as is, but be managed a little bit better, be a little bit less racist. Similarly, the problem is not that there's not enough quote unquote racial equity or equitable racial outcomes within the system. The problem is that children and families are experiencing harm and separation and surveillance and punishment within a system. Therefore, no amount of making things more proportional or making things more equitable would change that. Like, we don't just want less removals for Black children and families. I don't want to see Black children and families separated by a system. So I think when, things sound good to us, again, most folks are well-meaning people, are recognizing that there are issues within the existing system and are like, well, what do we do about that? And, reducing racial disproportionality and disparities and increasing racial equity are often the cause that larger agencies in the state, latch on to and sound good. But when we're unpacking them, the idea that these are goals to work towards doesn't really fundamentally disrupt the harm that the system is perpetuating in these communities, which is why we say we need to end the system completely if we really want to get rid of the harms that people are experiencing at the hands of the system.
Thank you. If I can go back, I just sort of like threw out there this concept of a warm line, and I wondered if you all could give us just a really quick analysis of warm lines and the purpose they serve, and just how you view them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that are thrown at us in this space, they sound really good. And they're meant to sound really good. So it sounds great. Instead of a hotline, let's call it a warm line, which is really just a semantical change. But like let's make things sound nicer and friendlier and better. And the issue with that is that it doesn't really decrease the surveillance and the monitoring and then the punishment that is happening within the system from happening. So the more people that you're bringing to the attention of the family policing system, the more separations will happen, the more monitoring will happen, the more surveillance will happen. And like Melody, you said earlier, if if people are calling, and which they are, if they're calling these hotlines because people are in need of direct report, I mean, of material supports, of very concrete things, why are we funneling them through a system that has the capacity to do so much harm in order to get what they need? It seems to make more sense to me that, you know, we should just be providing people with their very basic needs. And if we're not able to, we should be reaching out to folks who can provide people with their very basic needs. But calling more people to the attention of a harmful system is never going to create good outcomes for people.
Okay, great. And I'm going to rely on the team to help me kind of prompt me, because we have a number of great questions here for you all. I don't think we'll make it through all of them. So toward the end of the book, you acknowledge some of the critiques of your work, specifically those who say things like abolition is not supported by evidence and abolition will only result in more children being harmed. But you say it's abolitionists who care most about children's safety. And what do you mean by that?
I think for that one, it's just important to point out that people who are most vocally anti-abolition efforts really haven't taken the time, or perhaps intentionally misunderstand and misrepresent the work that we're trying to do. While abolitionists do want to end this harmful system, what we're really trying to do, and what we spend much more time thinking about, is how to build a society and create conditions in society where a child welfare system would never be brought into existence, because people have everything they need and children have everything they need to live and thrive in their homes and in their communities. We abolitionists also recognize the harm and trauma that forcible family separation causes to children. We can't respond to harm by inflicting more harm on children and families. People who are against this idea believe that children need to be surveilled, that children need to be punished, that they need to be forcibly separated from their families. We think that that forcible separation and all of the harm and trauma that comes along with that needs to stop. So that's what we mean when we say it's abolitionists who really care about children's safety, because we want the harm that the system causes to end.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what we're going to do now is move to just sort of an open Q&A. And invite anybody who'd like to, if you could just raise your hand and we'll acknowledge you. I'm going to ask one of the team members to let me know. I don't think I can see everybody in this view. Does anybody want to pose a question directly? Okay. Okay, and you're very welcome. Thanking us for this. Okay, if we don't have any questions, what we can do is we're going to go ahead and move to the next segment. And
Well, it looks like someone has a question.
Okay, great. Please go right ahead.
I have a question. I recently lived in Texas. I had a CPS case with my family. We were able to successfully prevent our children from being removed from our home with the help of a friend who was a social worker who kind of knew the ins and outs of CPS. And so one of the things that we saw in Texas specifically was that children are, being removed, and parents' rights are terminated without kind of due process, and children are being trafficked to private adoption. And so this question is kind of for you, Melody. Is that being seen nationwide, like as in DC and other areas? I now live in California. I feel a lot safer here, but I'm just wondering, is that the reality? Are we seeing this connection between CPS or family policing and private adoption and trafficking that way?
So I'm not sure about the private adoption trafficking component, but I mean, I will say in Washington, D.C., what appears to be the biggest problem is the hidden foster care system, which we didn't even really touch upon today, where there's sort of like this subjudicial, outside of a court system, coercion of parents to place their children with someone else without the advice of counsel. And the children then, often become sort of permanently lost to their parents. We see a lot of use of the third party custody law here in DC, which operates outside of the current court abuse and neglect system, where the goal there is family reunification. And when cases end up through this hidden foster care system with a third party pursuing custody through the domestic relations branch, the goal there is not reunification. And the judges are often unlikely and unwilling to disturb the placements, those temporary custody placements. That's one way that, we're sort of focusing our efforts here in DC. That's a nationwide problem. But I'm going to also just kind of pass this on to Alan and Maya if they have any responses. There's also a lot of placement of children in pre-adoptive homes. So if a child is removed and the goal is reunification, why do you place particularly those children 0 to 3 in pre-adoptive homes? So that is, the largest group of sort of permanent terminations of parental rights here in DC. The last I checked the data. So so I would say, yes, these problems are prevalent here in Washington, DC.
And it looks like we have another hand up.
Okay, yes, please. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to thank you all for this platform. The discussions are very great. I do have a question. I just wanted to know, what supports are there for a lot of this work centered around narrative change? Because that's a lot of, what I'm hearing. How do you create that narrative? What is that true depiction of families and what they are experiencing? And just working within the child welfare system, sometimes it does get caught up in data, that it's hard for people to understand that data reflects to somebody's experiences, somebody's life, and just how to make that connection more, especially for my state, in particular, South Carolina, where, very strong stance against critical race theory. So it's very hard to push certain narratives within certain political climates as well. Are there any supports for states or jurisdictions that have this problem?
So Alan or Maya, do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and Alan, please jump in. I think the over-reliance on especially quantitative data within this field of research is something that's extremely frustrating and also very limiting. I know that we have been trying to really disrupt that and saying that no amount of statistics and no amount of, improved outcomes as seen through quantitative data can change folks' experiences. So in a lot of ways, it's really about lifting up what people are actually experiencing and using either more qualitative research methods if you're a researcher, but also letting people tell their own stories about what they're experiencing and what they're facing within these systems as sort of like a counter narrative to the way that data is used to really bolster and support like that the system works. I also definitely understand the difficulties of doing this type of work in a state like South Carolina. I can speak less to the particular terrains of South Carolina, but as a whole nationally, people aren't that abolition friendly across the board. And I think it really takes connecting with like-minded folks in your state and sort of working to like push these narratives out in any way you can with people that you're connected with. I don't know, Alan, if you have anything else to add there.
If you're in a place where data is important, or where data is viewed as being important by the people in your agency and the people that are decision makers, I think one strategy you can do is point to two important data points that we often talk about at UpEND. One, the reality that up to 70% of children in foster care right now are in foster care because of what the state calls neglect, which is largely related to poverty. So this isn't a system that's responding to children largely who are being harmed. The second thing is pointing to the decades of data that show how harmful forcibly separating children from their parents are and the outcomes of that. Outcomes like homelessness, joblessness, poverty, mental health concerns, suicidal ideation, substance abuse disorders. Those are the outcomes of forcibly separating children from their families. And that's the narrative that we really want people to start to understand. And there's volumes of data that you can use to support that piece of it. Oh, Melody, you're on mute.
Thanks. Thank you for that question. And it really does move us toward this next segment. I see folks are starting to leave. We really wanted to talk about if people want to learn more about this work or get more involved, where can they go or what should they do, Alan and Maya?
Well, we can start with the UpEND movement, UpEndMovement.org. That's where we have the resource that Maya talked about earlier to evaluate reforms. We also have our policy platform at UpEndMovement.org, which is a report called How We End Up, A Future Without Family Policing, where we give our big policy ideas about how to move towards abolition of this system. So if the concept of abolition is new to you, the idea, some of the things that we've talked about today are new and you want to learn more, UpEndMovement.org is a great place to start. And we also just launched this past fall a podcast that builds the case for abolition. So it's an 8-episode podcast. I'm a guest on some of them. Maya's a guest on some of them. Victoria Copeland, Brianna Harvey, who Maya mentioned earlier. I think these 8 episodes together really walk through from the era of slavery to today what the abolitionist movement is all about.
Great, thank you. And our coalition is currently exploring alternatives to the system. And I'm going to ask Raquan, she can share a slide. So, some of the features that we are working toward building for alternatives here in DC are, kind of putting together programming for families who ultimately are impacted by this system or who are at risk, which is essentially being, a person who is experiencing poverty and Black in Washington, D.C. So our efforts are community driven. We work in terms of coalition building. The narrative change is important to us. And so we have been working in alliance with a number of different organizations focused on economic justice. Because for us, the work is the work of eliminating poverty. And so the name of our coalition, we are working toward building concrete supports and such as cash, giving people, enough cash that they can live with dignity and meet their basic needs. And our focus on our programming, which we think is essential for any alternatives, is to promote parent agency. So let's go to the next slide really quickly. We want to again, and I do want to thank Maya and Alan, and we have a little bit of a plug in a moment for the book, but and then please do visit UpEndMovement.org. We want to just share with you as we work toward this world of where there is no family policing. We in the Moms group have put together, and we are really excited because our next webinar series will be a panel of moms, including from our Washington, D.C. community and across the country. And what we're doing is we are working toward addressing big policy change, such as what was discussed earlier by Alan and Maya, increasing due process protections for parents while we do have this system. Including following in the steps of some jurisdictions, but the continued fight for this in New York for parents receiving what is Miranda-style rights when a CPS investigation ensues. And then we want to, again, focused on guaranteed income, guaranteed housing. We want to, cease harmful practices perpetuated by the family policing system. And so our moms study and testify and do research on proposals to expand that system. And we would love for you to get engaged with the coalition to support those efforts. And again, our work is to strengthen the existing social safety net and enhance it. So all of these are ways in which we are working toward a world that provides true support for moms who can end up, and parents, generally families that get caught up in the system. So let's move really quickly to the next slide. So we've had some Q&A, and I want to just pause here and say that, you know, the book that Alan and his co-authors and editors put together is, you know, absolutely critical for you all to read. I find it just, you know, deeply disturbing, but fascinating and very, you know, critical to understand the roots of, you know, what we see as a lot of sort of racialized harms, and this one being one of the most destructive to Black families and, in fact, to our entire democracy. So we, you know, would absolutely encourage you all to scan the QR code, you know, run to Amazon and buy this book. It is just essential reading. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, we want to just pause here and just, you know, say this webinar series, and we're so excited that Maya and Alan are kind of advising us, and, you know, we're putting together additional programming, and our next one, we don't have dates set yet, but we've begun conversations, and our next webinar will be focused on impacted parents and their perspectives and their advocacy and what they're doing. We also, you know, New York is just like a leading sort of, you know, part of the country in this respect, and addressing harms and exploring alternatives. And so we will also have a panel of leaders. We are hoping that Joyce McMillan and Angela Burton, among others, will join us. Nora McCarthy, we're just looking forward to putting that one together. And then we're also, you know, going to revisit the topic more broadly of alternatives. And we're really just hoping to keep the dialogue and the, you know, kind of information sharing going. And we welcome any topics that you all might have as well. So thank you so much. Let's see. And then these are just some local, for people who are interested. We've just wanted to provide you all with some very specific activities that are coming up. You know, we regularly testify on, you know, emerging legislative efforts. We are ourselves putting forth legislative efforts, including to create a right to an attorney once you're under an investigation. And then currently there are budget oversight hearings where the agencies are called before the city council to talk about their proposed budgets for their initiatives. We've already testified this season on the performance of the agencies. Some of that information we've shared already. We also testify before economic justice related bodies of the city council because we are, again, focused on ending poverty. And so, you know, we put together trainings every oversight season. So you all are welcome to join to learn more about what we're doing in that regard, and, you know, pull together your own testimony if you have your stories you'd like to tell. We'd be happy to help you. Let's move on to the next slide. And then we absolutely want your partnership. We want you to join us. What we're doing is putting together our list. We are hoping at some point very soon to meet and start talking about building upon our existing mission and platform. We know that there are parts of the community that are working on issues, mandated reporting, rights of survivors. We hate, and it's, you know, a horrible harm that women usually who are domestic violence survivors are subject to having their children removed under our current neglect statute. So we would, you know, welcome your participation in our efforts. So please join us. And then we have a reading list that we will place on our website, but we, you know, I think we're going to put some of the links here in the chat. So in addition to Alan and Maya's book, we're encouraging you all to read, of course, Dorothy Roberts, like Alan, a distinguished scholar in this field who's written immensely, Torn Apart. We Were Once a Family, which I found particularly as a journalist that the author conveys stories. We talked about narrative change earlier, and then there are a number of articles we recommend as well. I think we're pretty much at our time now, so I'm going to also just move one more slide I think we have. And we really just hope that you'll join our efforts. And I want to, again, ask you to join me in thanking Alan and Maya for joining us today. It just was so educational, and I'm, just really excited to partner with you all to put this together, and look forward to continuing to partner with you moving forward. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us to be here today.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks for having us.
Yes. Okay.